Janice Wright had always been ambitious. As a rising star at the prestigious Johnson & Morgan advertising agency in Chicago, she knew how to navigate the competitive world of marketing. Her dedication, creativity, and keen eye for detail had earned her respect among her colleagues. But what she hadn't expected was falling for Carl Thompson, a talented creative director with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of humor. They had been discreet, careful to keep their budding romance under wraps. Office relationships were frowned upon, and neither of them wanted to become office gossip. But what they had was real, electric, and intoxicating. Late nights in the office turned into stolen moments, brainstorming sessions into whispered exchanges. Carl had a way of making her laugh, of easing the tension from even the most grueling of workdays. His creativity was unmatched, passion contagious. And Janice was drawn to him in a way she had never been to anyone else. However, she wasn't the only one watching Carl. Neil Johnson, the agency's CEO and Janice's boss, had always exuded power and confidence. His presence commanded attention in any room he entered, his charisma masking the ruthlessness beneath. To most, he was an influential leader, a man who had built the agency into one of the most successful firms in the city. But to Janice, he had become something much more sinister. Neil had been subtle at first. Compliments, invitations to exclusive industry events, veiled suggestions of what they could be together. Janice had brushed them off, unwilling to believe that he was serious. After all, he was her boss, and she had no intention of mixing business with personal affairs, especially when her heart belonged to Carl. But when she made it clear she wasn't interested, Neil's demeanor changed. The charm faded, replaced by something far more menacing. One evening, he called her into his office under the pretense of discussing an important client pitch. As she entered, she immediately sensed the shift in the air. The blinds were drawn, the lighting dim. Neil sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, his fingers steepled together as he regarded her with an unreadable expression. "I want to be honest with you, Janice," he began, his voice smooth, almost persuasive. "I see great potential in you. You have a bright future here." She straightened, keeping her expression neutral. "Thank you, Neil. I appreciate that." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "But I also see something else, a distraction. Your involvement with Carl Thompson." Janice's stomach dropped. "I don't think my personal life affects my work, Neil." He gave a slow, almost predatory smile. "Oh, but it does, and I'm afraid it's a problem." Her pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" Neil's gaze hardened. "I can make Carl disappear." His voice was quiet, but carried a weight that sent a shiver down her spine. "If you don't want his career to crumble, you'll walk away from him, immediately." Janice was horrified. Her first instinct was to fight back, to call his bluff. But she knew better. Neil had power, connections. He could ruin Carl's career with a single phone call, turn him into a pariah in the industry. And Carl had worked too hard, sacrificed too much for her to let that happen. With a heavy heart, she did the one thing she never imagined. She pushed Carl away. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she replayed Neil's threat over and over in her mind. The thought of losing Carl was unbearable, but the thought of watching him suffer because of her was even worse. The next morning, she walked into the office with a mask of indifference firmly in place. Carl greeted her with a warm smile, but she forced herself to look past the kindness in his eyes. "I think we should stop seeing each other," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Carl's smile faded. "What? Janice, what's wrong?" She steeled herself. "I just don't feel the same anymore." A flicker of pain crossed his face, but he nodded slowly. "If that's what you want." As she turned away, she felt her heart shatter into a million pieces. But she didn't look back. She couldn't. Because if she did, she knew she wouldn't be able to go through with it. Neil had won, at least for now. Carl didn't understand. One day, Janice was his greatest supporter. The next, she was distant, indifferent. Every attempt he made to talk to her was met with dismissive responses. The warmth in her eyes had been replaced with a cold detachment that sent him spiraling. At first, he tried to convince himself it was stress, a temporary rift. But the more he reached out, the further she withdrew. When he finally confronted her, she barely met his gaze. "Is there someone else?" he asked one evening, his voice tinged with desperation. Janice hesitated for a fraction of a second. just enough for him to see the turmoil in her eyes before she masked it. "I just don't feel the same anymore." Carl felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. How could someone so deeply in love with him one moment be so cold the next? He tried to move on, throwing himself into work, but nothing filled the void she left behind. His creativity suffered, his passion dimmed. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was betrayal. Then Neil Johnson delivered the final blow. "I thought you should know," Neil told Carl over drinks, feigning sympathy. "Janice and I have been involved for months. She just didn't know how to tell you." Carl left the bar that night a broken man. The woman he loved had not only abandoned him, but had been with another man all along. The sting of betrayal was unbearable. But something nagged at him. Janice's sudden change, Neil's smugness, it didn't sit right. It wasn't until a colleague and friend, Marcus Reynolds, pulled him aside that he learned the truth. "You're being played, Carl," Marcus said. "Janice never betrayed you." Neil threatened her. Rage coursed through Carl's veins. He had let Neil manipulate him, let him destroy what he had with Janice. But no more. Carl wasn't just going to expose Neil, he was going to destroy him. Determined to expose Neil, Carl started digging. He combed through company records, reviewed old emails, and talked to former employees who had mysteriously left the firm. What he found was shocking. Neil had a history of coercion and manipulation, using his influence to bend people to his will. With Marcus's help, Carl gathered undeniable evidence. Late-night meetings, shady transactions, threats made to others. It was all there. Carl and Marcus set up a detailed timeline of Neil's activities, linking financial records to secret deals and tracing transactions that led to corporate fraud. They gathered statements from past victims, ensuring every claim had backing. The only question remaining was how to take Neil down without exposing Janice in the process. Carl was no longer just a heartbroken man. He was a man on a mission for justice, and he wouldn't stop until Neil was destroyed. Carl had always been meticulous when it came to strategy, but this time, it wasn't about a campaign, it was about vengeance. With the evidence gathered, he and Marcus laid out a carefully constructed plan. There was no room for error. They knew Neil was cautious. He had built a powerful network of allies who either feared him or were complicit in his corruption. A direct confrontation wouldn't work. Instead, Carl decided to dismantle Neil's empire from within. The first step was leaking some of the gathered evidence anonymously to key industry figures. Whispers of financial misconduct and coercion began to spread, putting Neil under unwanted scrutiny. Clients started to second-guess their partnerships with the agency, and competitors sniffed out blood in the water. Next, Marcus used his network to plant an insider among Neil's trusted staff, an accountant who was more than willing to testify against him once the truth was fully revealed. Meanwhile, Carl sought out Janice. He couldn't let her remain under Neil's control, living in fear. When he confronted her in private, she was hesitant, afraid of what Neil might do. But Carl's determination was unwavering. "We're taking him down," Carl assured her. "But I need you to trust me." Tears welled in Janice's eyes. "I never stopped loving you, Carl," she admitted. "I just didn't know how to fight him." Carl reached for her hand. "You don't have to. Let me handle it." As the noose tightened around Neil, Carl and Marcus prepared the final strike, a full-blown exposé in a major business publication. They compiled all the evidence into a devastating report that not only implicated Neil, but also highlighted his history of intimidation, fraud, and unethical practices. The moment the article went live, chaos erupted. Investors pulled out. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. The company was on the brink of collapse, and Neil knew it. As Carl watched the man who had tried to destroy him scramble to contain the damage, he felt something he hadn't in months: satisfaction. But the game wasn't over yet. Carl had one final move to make. Carl knew that simply exposing Neil wasn't enough. He needed to ensure that Neil could never wield his power again. The board was in turmoil, shareholders were backing out, and the agency's reputation was crumbling. But Neil was not one to go down without a fight. As Carl anticipated, Neil tried to shift the blame. He called a press conference, hoping to paint himself as the victim of an elaborate smear campaign. His speech was carefully rehearsed, but Carl had prepared for this moment. Minutes before Neil was set to take the podium, Carl and Marcus released the final piece of evidence, an audio recording of Neil threatening Janice. The file circulated online within minutes, spreading like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage, and Neil's press conference turned into a disaster as reporters bombarded him with questions he couldn't answer. Janice, finally freed from Neil's control, decided to step forward. She went on record about the threats she had endured, ensuring Neil couldn't twist the narrative in his favor. The board of directors had no choice but to oust him permanently, and legal authorities began investigating his financial crimes. But Carl wasn't satisfied yet. He confronted Neil one last time in his now empty office. "You thought you could manipulate people forever," Carl said calmly. "But you underestimated me. You underestimated all of us." Neil, cornered and humiliated, sneered. "You think this is over?" Carl leaned in, his voice low and firm. "It is for you." Within days, Neil's assets were frozen, his legal battles mounting. The industry that once feared him now turned its back on him. His reign of terror was over. With Neil gone, Carl and Janice finally had the freedom they deserved. The road to rebuilding their relationship wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it together. As they stood overlooking the city from Carl's apartment, Janice took his hand. "We did it," she whispered. Carl smiled, pulling her close. "No, Janice, you did it. You survived him, and now we can finally move forward." For the first time in months, the future looked bright. Neil Johnson was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a fallen king who had lost everything. And Carl and Janice? They had won. Months passed, and life at the agency slowly began to heal. Under new leadership, the toxic environment Neil had cultivated was replaced with collaboration and trust. Carl was promoted to a senior creative role, his talent finally receiving the recognition it deserved. Janice, too, thrived in her career, her confidence and determination stronger than ever. One evening, as they strolled through Millennium Park, Carl turned to Janice with a thoughtful expression. "After everything we've been through, I know one thing for sure. I don't want to go through life without you." Janice smiled, her heart swelling. "Neither do I." With the city lights reflecting in their eyes, Carl pulled out a small velvet box and opened it, revealing a ring. "Janice Wright, will you marry me?" Tears brimmed in her eyes, but this time they were of pure joy. "Yes, Carl, 1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, applause erupted around them from onlookers who had witnessed the proposal. But for Carl and Janice, the rest of the world faded away. They had faced heartbreak, deception, and betrayal. But through it all, their love had endured. Now, as they stepped into their future together, they knew one thing for certain. Love, when tested, only grows stronger. And this was just the beginning of their happily ever after. Thanks for listening to Green Tea Tales. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you.